This is Voluminous, a listening books podcast for every kind of reader, but especially for fans of audiobooks. I'm Jessica Stone, and today I've snagged the writer Simon Brett, author of over 100 books, including several popular crime series, perhaps the best known of which is the Charles Paris books, and someone who's written for radio and television as well. Welcome, Simon.
Thank you.
I know you've just come back from holiday, so I'm really pleased that you...
Yes. No, I've just been... I was in Seattle on Saturday. Yep. And Canada before that, which was delightful. Yes,
wonderful. Yes.
It.
You picked up on the North American in my accent immediately.
Yes, I did. But I was... I'm still trying to work out what is different about the Canadian accent from the US accent. I haven't quite
aren't we
it,
all?
You know. So I don't think I'll be putting any Canadians in my books if I'm going to be reading them, because I have to be very careful about, not to write characters I can't pronounce, if you see what I mean.
Yes. Yes. Actually, I want to hear more about your experience of reading your own books as well. I think before we get to that, I would like to explain my thinking about this episode to listeners. I think I explained it to you in the email when I pitched this to you. But the way we do Voluminous, we do 2 episodes a month. And in the first episode, we have a general roundup and discussion of books on a particular theme. And this month, we did a roundup of books that we thought, and there were 2 others with me, that we thought were even better as audiobooks than in the traditional printed format. And I want to stress even better because...
Yes. Oh, you're very diplomatic.
It's not meant to be a slight on the original text. But the reason I thought you'd be great for this episode is that quite a few of your books fit into one or more of the groups we thought were often better as a general rule as audiobooks. And even one that we didn't think of at the time, but that I noticed later. So, for example, books narrated by their authors was a favorite category. You've done some of that. We're going to talk about that. Books with full cast performances were another favorite.
Yeah, those are wonderful.
And yes, you've got several of those. Of course, the BBC production of the Charles Paris book starring Bill Nighy. Remarkable, great performance. I was listening to one on the way in this morning. And then one that we didn't think about, but I think someone tweeted about this during Love Audio Week, was that with crime novels, with mysteries, you can't accidentally spoil a reveal by glancing at the wrong part of the page.
No, and you can't go back very well. I mean, you can go back, but it's quite difficult to find, did he say that she had red hair? I can't remember, that was on page 15. But I mean, to actually find that as a listener is quite difficult. Of course, there is a problem, which is occasionally a device that crime writers use, and I've been guilty of using it myself, is that you can write a scene, say it's the denouement, and the villain is being unmasked. And for a long time, you can sustain the illusion of whether it is a male or a female. Of course, if you're reading it as an audio, there is no way you can get around. So you kind of upstage your own reveal if you use that particular device, because obviously the voice that you're going to use is either male or female. So that
have you used that particular device?
I have been guilty of that. Yes.
And how did you solve that then?
I mean, there's nothing you can do about it.
Okay.
There really isn't, because if you've been characterizing the voices throughout, you can't suddenly have them have an anonymous voice.
Right.
I mean, I just sort of thought, I'm afraid the audio listeners are going to know the murderer like 2 pages before the readers. No, you can't get around that. But I mean, you do, I don't think I'd use that again, because I sort of, I got caught up on that.
Yes.
And there are things the most recent audiobook I did, which is one of my Fethering mysteries called The Killer in the Choir. And there's a character in that, Carol, who's one of the Fethering investigators, who claims to be tone deaf and claims she can't sing. I actually am tone deaf and can't sing. And I'd forgotten until I came to doing the audio that it finishes with Carol thinking nobody's listening, singing to her grandchildren. And her friend Jude hears her at the door and says, oh, actually, that was in tune. So when I came to record it, I sort of had to sing The Wheels on the Bus, that great historic international tune. And I said to the producer, look, I don't know whether this is in tune, so can you tell me? And the producer said, I'm tone deaf too.
Oh, no.
So we have no idea. I mean, at the end of this book, there is this great reveal, and either it's in tune or it's not, but it is said to be in tune.
Right.
So you can get caught up on surprising things when you're doing
I love
audiobooks.
that the meaning could be different based on whether the listener interpreted that it was in tune or wasn't in tune.
Oh, I rather like that. It's some subtext, isn't it?
Yes.
Yeah, so her friend was just being generous, saying that was in tune. That's yes, it would need a couple more chapters to explain that. But yeah, no, I like that.
That's wonderful. Before, and I'm tempted just to follow that trail and continue on talking about the audio productions, but before I forget, I noticed when I was looking up your bio that you produced the pilot episode of Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy.
I did, yes. I was a radio producer. I mean, kind of my first job out of university. Well, actually, my first job out of university was Father Christmas in a department store. But after that, I was a radio producer, and I knew all that generation of Cambridge footlights, like John Lloyd and Griff Rhys-Jones and Douglas Adams. And Douglas was he was around, and I kept trying to get him to write stuff. And I was then producing...
you knew him personally?
Oh, yes. And I was, there was a topical news program called Weekending, which ran for years and years. And I was we're talking 1970s. And I was trying to get Douglas to write sort of wacky, sort of 30-second quickies about Margaret Thatcher for Weekending. And I never was there such a mismatch between talent and task. But I kept saying, oh, you must do something of your own, because he had a very original mind. And so anyway, he said he'd work out some ideas on his own. And I remember he came into my office one Friday morning, as I recall, with 3 ideas, one of which was The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. And I remember I said, well, I think, doing humorous science fiction, no one's doing it at the moment. Because, I mean, nobody was really. Terry Pratchett was long in the future. Yeah. Well, he wasn't around at that point. Yeah. Well, I mean, he was physically around, but he hadn't started writing books.
Yes.
So we went with The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. And neither of us could ever remember what the other 2 ideas were. But and then we made the pilot, and I was then, I'd sort of got to the status in radio where I'd had some successful stuff, so they kind of trusted my instincts to an extent. And I remember after we recorded the pilot, and also I was the only person who ever got a script on time from Douglas, because it was the pilot. You see, we couldn't record it till we got the script. So everyone else, the stories of Douglas's late delivery on scripts are quite legendary. He had that lovely line where he said, oh, I like deadlines. I like the whooshing noise they make as they go past. But anyway, we made this pilot, and I was sat down with my head of department, the head of light entertainment, and 2 senior producers. And at the end, my boss said, Simon, is it funny? And I said, I promise you, Con, it is funny. And from that moment, he backed it completely and, backed it for Radio 4, and the series was made. And the reason I only made the pilot was that, in fact, it was about the last job I did for radio, because I'd just been offered a new job as a television producer at what was then London Weekend Television. But, it was a kind of, a legendary period. And it's a lovely thing to have on my CV, really.
Yeah. But did your time in radio, did it affect how you then wrote your books?
I think very much so, actually, because I think particularly that I realised that when I listened to a radio play, I made my own pictures. And in fact, when I read a book, I make my own pictures, almost regardless of what the author is telling me people look like, And so I do very little physical description in my novels. And that, I think, is based on my radio experience, that I like the reader or listener to do a bit of work. So, I provide what the character is like, and then the listener or the reader adds their own bit from somebody they met who looked a bit like that, or that kind of thing. And I quite like that. So there's very little physical description of characters in my books, and I think that is quite deliberate. And also, I'd much rather define a character by the things they say than what they look like. So my books are very heavy on dialogue, and I do love dialogue as a means of telling a story and, giving information about characters. I love those things where somebody says something and you sort of think, where did that come from? Why did they say that? And you as a writer, you spend a lot of time listening, and you very rarely use a sentence in the sort of the situation in which you heard it, but you just hear something and you think, there's something in that. I don't know what it is, but there's something I can use there. I mean, there's one I remember, and this is back ages. I've never used it, but in 1967, it was the first year that Bob Dylan played the Isle of Wight, I remember. And I was going up to the Edinburgh Festival, and I picked up a hitchhiker. And we chatted about this and that. And he had been to the Bob Dylan concert, which is how I can date it. And I think he was an electrician or something. So, we were just talking about general stuff. And then it kind of went quiet in the car. And he said, after quite a long silence, he said, do you mind if I ask you something? I said, no, that's fine. He said, because I'll probably never see you again. I said, no, what? And then he said, do you think I've got a big nose? And I, when he got in the car, it's perfectly ordinary sized nose. Now it's kind of encroaching on my peripheral vision. And I said, no, perfectly ordinary sized nose. And that was the end of, we talked about other stuff. Now I've remembered that all these years, more than 40, more than 50 years.
Because he said it was encroaching on his peripheral vision.
Well, no, it's more that because I'll probably never see you again.
Yes.
Do you mind if I ask you something? Because I'll probably never see you again.
Yeah.
And that is so kind of spooky. And as I say, I've never actually used it in a book, but you hear something like that.
You're saving it, are you?
Well, for the right moment. And I think as a writer, you get better at, you just pick these things up and you think there's something I can use there. I don't know what it is yet. But you do get better at spotting them.
I wonder if you might talk us through the different detective series that you have. Just give us a little summary and how they differ in sort of style and...
Okay. Well, my first published book was a Charles Paris mystery, and Charles Paris is an actor detective who is now, I'm delighted to say, on Radio 4 in the wonderful form of Bill Nye playing...
Yes. Also in the Listening Books Library.
Yes, well, good. And I had written... I'd always wanted to write. I never thought it was a realistic ambition as a profession. And I think I'd written 3 or possibly 4 very properly unpublished novels. And as a radio producer, I was delegated to produce a series of adaptations of the Dorothy L. Sayers Lord Peter Wimsey series.
Oh, yes.
And Ian Carmichael, the actor who played it on television, and they wanted to do it on radio with him. And we had to have new adaptations of the books. And I had always been rather frightened of crime fiction. I thought you had to have a computerized brain to work out the plotting. But I worked very closely with a writer called Chris Miller, who adapted those books. And we found some very encouraging things. I mean, we found great holes in Dorothy L. Sayers' plots, which was very encouraging. But we also found that although the plot was important, character and dialogue were at least as important. And so I thought, well, I don't know whether I can do plots, but I think I can do character and dialogue. And so I started, and then I thought an actor detective is just an interesting idea because it enables me to explore theatre, which I'm fascinated by anyway. And I chose very early to have an amateur detective. And already you're in the realms of fantasy because there has never been an amateur detective in the history of the universe. And I was also working with a lot of middle-aged actors at that time. And I was then in my late 20s. And, there was something fascinating about actors in their 40s, 50s, 60s who I was working with. And so I thought, well, maybe an actor detective. And so Charles Paris sort of sprang fully formed. And I think also, actually, my wife was then pregnant with our first child, and I kind of thought it's about time I did something creative as well. So I wrote the first Charles Paris. And in fact, I remember about a month after our daughter Sophie was born, I had a letter from Victor Gollanc's publishers, from Livia Gollancz, who was the daughter of the founder, saying that she'd be interested in publishing this book if I was prepared to do a bit of rewriting. And I was very prepared to do a bit of rewriting. And I thought, my life really is changing. I've now got a child and there's the prospect of And I immediately sat down and thought, could I give up the day job? I was then a radio producer. And for the advance that I got for that first book, I worked out that to match my BBC salary, I could give up the day job so long as I wrote a book a month.
Oh.
So my first advance was exactly a month's salary at the BBC. So it took me a few more years before I became a full-time writer.
Right.
I did spend a lot of time doing sums then. And then, as I say, I moved to television to be a television producer and kind of, well, it was, when I was in my early 30s when I actually gave up the day job. And I've now been a full-time writer for 40 years. Gosh, yes.
Yes. So that's the Charles Paris series. And I really quite like the titles in this series.
No, I had great fun with the titles. I always, in fact, the first one, the first book was originally called Baron Hardup because I don't know if you know the Cinderella pantomime story. Cinderella's father is almost always in the pantomimes called Baron Hardup. Mm-hmm. And I thought it was the kind of perfect character for Charles Paris to have played. Right. And there was a kind of bit of a backstory about him meeting someone who he'd been in a production of Cinderella with at some point. So I called it Baron Hardup. And it became clear that Livia Gallant, my rather straight-laced editor, I wasn't familiar with the Cinderella story and thought the title was just a dirty joke, you see. So I had to change the title, and I came up with Cast in Order of Disappearance, which I think it's a great title.
It's a very clever title.
But it's totally wrong for that book, actually. I mean,
really?
Yeah, it doesn't fit that book at all. But never mind. I mean, it's a good title.
It is a good title. It's a great one to start out with. Yeah. I think I've read before that, I mean, because you've obviously written for lots of different formats. You've written for book, for radio, for theatre, for television. And I think I read that when you moved to television, that wasn't as enjoyable an experience as radio. Was there something about the format itself, or was it more the time of your life when you were...
I think it was two things. I think, the writing had just started to take off. So I was beginning to, and I sort of got to the point where I was making almost as much money from my spare time activity as writing as I was from the day job of producing. But I mean, obviously I had no time, and we'd just started, we'd got one child and then the second was on the way. So I thought something's got to give. Also, I found television terribly slow after radio because it's such a technical medium that it all takes so long. And whereas in radio, I could be working on 6 different productions at the same time at various stages of advance. In television, I tend to be working on one series at a time. And so it was two things. I mean, I think, and also television then was very unionized, and I was a producer, but I hadn't got a director's ticket. And it seemed to me that most of the fun was happening with the director, who was actually working with the actors and, rehearsing. And I would just appear as the producer, who is senior, but I'd just come in on and sort of say, everything okay? And they'd say, and if they said it was okay, then I'd go away again, really. So I didn't find it a very creative period of my life. But I think it was more that the writing was calling. Yep.
The adaptation that I was listening to this morning, and I chose it based on the title, it's called The Dead Side of the Mic.
Yep.
And so I was listening to the 2008 adaptation with Bill Nighy.
Okay.
But the book was written in 1980. Is that correct?
Yep.
Yes. And so I thought it was really interesting because there was a reference to back before the digital age when tape was physically edited, cut, and with a razor blade or whatever. And then sure enough, moments later, it turns out that razor blade is a murder weapon.
Absolutely, yes.
And I thought...
Very state of the art at the time, let me tell you.
Yes. Well, I thought, put that in the column for the digital age. Less likely to be murdered by the equipment.
Yeah. No, I mean, the adaptations, the Radio 4 adaptations, are done by a very brilliant writer called Jeremy Frunt, who is, in fact, the brother of Rebecca Frunt, the actress.
Ah, yes.
And, I mean, the last one that he did... what was it called? It was called Star Trap. And I listened to it, and there wasn't a single line of mine in it.
No.
But I mean, that's fine. But because, when I wrote those books, the thing that I was proud about was that I was kind of at the cutting edge of show business and I was getting the details right.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm now more removed from that world, but Jeremy is. So the last one in particular, I thought he kept the shape of my story, but he, updated it in a very skillful way.
Yeah.
And I mean, it's great for me because I get the kind of, a lot of the kudos and he does all the work. So, I mean, I remember there was a preview of not this most recent series, but another one, and it quoted a couple of lines from the script. And I remember what it said. It said, "Who could have written these but the phenomenal Simon Brett?"
Oh.
And in fact, both of them were written by Jeremy Front. So I emailed him with apologies, but I wasn't that sorry. I didn't really mind.
You mentioned before that you initially didn't think that you could write crime fiction because you thought the plotting of it must be so intricate and involve calculations and such.
Yeah.
So I'm curious about how you found eventually the actual plotting.
Yes, the actual plotting, I think I was helped in the crime plotting by the fact that I wrote quite a lot of comedy as well. I mean, I wrote sitcoms like After Henry, and it's very similar, actually, because comedy plotting is based on if that's got to happen, that has to have happened there. Does the audience know enough about this to get the joke? And it's very much, there's a phase I go through when I'm planning a book, which I think of as the Lego phase of writing, where you've got all these little briquettes of information, which you have to get in a certain order. And no, that doesn't work. Now I've got to move that bit around there. And if I'm going to have that there, then I've got to move that there. I've got to change that character. That character has become more important. And that character who's just giving that bit of news, I could use them to do something else. And it's not the most creative part of it, but it's a necessary process that you have to go through. And I think probably my training in writing comedy helps that because I find comedy and crime are very similar. I mean, if you think a lot of jokes are based on the unexpected, the whole joke seems to be pointing in one direction and the payoff is something completely. And a lot of crime fiction's like that too. You have the interview with the investigator, be it policeman or whoever, with the suspect, and it all seems pointing towards some person's guilt, and then they say something at the end which sends you straight off in another direction. I mean, that's exactly the structure of a joke.
Okay.
So I find the two extremely similar.
Yes. Yes. So that means this is another question I was thinking I'm not sure you're going to want to answer, but I was wondering if you could give tips to readers of mysteries for how to spot the real killer or the real criminal. Like, how do you spot the red herring and how do you spot the misdirections? Is there a tip?
Well, obviously, as a writer, you hope they don't. I mean, generally, the sort of Agatha Christie principle, the least likely person is always. The other thing, I mean, there's supposed to be at various stages there have been rules of writing crime fiction. And I mean, basically, there are no rules. But I think the one that has sort of lasted from the golden age, so-called 1920s and 30s, which is still valid, is that the murderer, the perpetrator, has to be introduced fairly early on in the book.
Yeah.
So you can't, I mean, in the real world, a lot of murders are somebody completely from left field, who has nothing to do with anything. I mean, the kind of intricate little murder where you have 7 suspects, all of whom are deeply involved in the same premises or the same work or whatever, that almost never happens in the real world.
Right.
But
it's unsatisfying for the reader if somebody
it is,
if it's a stranger.
Yeah, exactly. So, I mean, if in a 20-chapter novel we first meet the murderer in chapter 19, we feel slightly cheated. So I think you have to do that. Yes, I mean, obviously the author is trying to second guess. So you spend a lot of time pointing suspicion in unlikely directions. And I quite often, I'll look at a plan of a book and I'll think, oh, that's all getting a bit too obvious. It's pointing towards, and I'll put, in my plan, it will say susp, which is short for suspicion, susp to Fred, and I'll just put a paragraph at the end, or someone will say something, so of course the person who hasn't told us what he was doing at the time was Fred. ooh.
Dun, dun,
And
dun.
you hope your reader is going, oh, I hadn't thought of Fred. And I mean, Fred is not going to appear again as a suspect ever, probably. But it's just a little tiny misdirection. So I would say watch the last sentence of chapters,
Okay.
because that is where your author is trying to be a bit clever.
Do you read other people's crime fiction?
Yes, I read quite a lot of crime fiction. I mean, not exclusively by any means, but...
and are you generally able to solve the...
Not particularly.
Okay.
No. And I'm not actually particularly interested in that element of it. I mean, if it's very satisfying, that's great. If it's really clever, then that's... But I'm much more interested in the sort of background and the quality of the writing, really. And sometimes, there is a sort of new kid on the block who is, highly praised and doing something wonderful. And often after a couple of chapters, I'll say, oh, I see. Yeah, I see what he's doing.
Right.
I mean, it doesn't mean I don't think it's good.
Yeah.
But I can see, and occasionally you read something and you think, God, where did that come from? How did the person think of that? And that's very exciting. But it doesn't happen very often.
I want to hear now about your experience of audiobook narration.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. So you've read some of your own books.
Almost all of them, actually.
All of them?
Yeah, pretty much.
Oh, amazing. But what's the experience like reading your own work?
I mean, when I was first asked to do it, and I've no idea who suggested that. I mean, I've done quite a lot of acting as an amateur in at university and that kind of thing, so I can sort of do voices. But how anyone knew I could do that when I was first asked to record the audio, I don't know. And I'm not quite sure when it was, but I'd written at least 5 or 6 books. And so the first one I was reading was indeed the first book, Cast in Order of Disappearance. And I found it a very strange experience because for a start, I'd written the book 10 years before or maybe something like that. And so I thought I'd got a bit better as a writer by then. So there were a few sentences I thought, actually, I could make that, I could get that a bit better. And the producer would put down the talkback key and say, could we have the text as printed, please? Oh. And I said, look, I wrote it. Can't I change it? He said, no, you can't. No, we're here to record the printed book.
Yes.
So, I mean, that was quite a shock. And also one or two things that, I write differently now. I know I'm going to record it. For instance, there are no Geordies in my books. No, I'm from Northern Ireland. I can't do the accent. And no, I'm from Canada. No Canadians. So, I mean, that is different. But I remember reading one. There was a really unhelpful thing in one of the books that I'd written before I ever thought I'd be reading it. And there was a speech of about 2 pages. And it came to the end and it said, he concluded his voice becoming more Welsh as he got drunker.
Oh, no.
And I thought, who wrote that? So you do come across things that you would do differently. I mean, in a way, I think it's not such a leap for me because I am a writer who hears voices. Yes. That sounds a bit spooky, but I mean, I do, once I've got a voice for a character, I find them quite easy to write. So I am dependent on voices very much. So I write a lot of dialogue, and that adapts well to the audio format. So that's quite useful. But I remember the first time I did it, I was booked for 2 days in a studio just near Lancaster Gate Tube Station, I recall. And I was so wiped out at the end of the first day that I actually did this thing that you read about people doing, and I'd always thought it was a fiction, but I went out for dinner in a local Italian restaurant, and I actually fell asleep in my spaghetti. I mean, literally face first in my spaghetti because I was so knackered. And it's a strange experience because also you I write relatively quickly, so the process of writing a book is 3-4 months, but still in that day and a half, it's a sort of microcosm of this experience. And you think, oh, God, that's when the boiler burst. As you get to the end of a chapter or something, and you remember things that happened in your life, which was sort of during the writing of the book. And that is quite a spooky experience. I mean, I love doing it, but it is still, I'm amazed how tiring it is.
Yeah. And I imagine, given how many books you have, I can't imagine you having time to narrate anybody else's books. Would you? Have you?
I've never
Or do
been
you?
asked.
No.
I've never been asked. I wouldn't mind doing it,
Okay.
but I think I'd find the preparation a lot more
Yes.
arduous because at least, that it's my rhythm. I mean,
Mm.
my writing rhythm. So I can often I have prepared the books obviously, but
And there's
when
no
I
worrying about pleasing the author
no,
with you
no.
with your books,
when I,
right?
when I when I turn the page, I normally know how the sentence would end because that's how.
Yes.
No, when I'm recording books, there's a lot of shouts of who wrote this rubbish come from me.
And I know that I can't keep you here forever, so I'm just going to ask you one last question, and we'll wrap it up from there. I want to know what project, whether it is a book or a radio show or a television show or pantomime or your role as Santa. I want to know what you've had the most fun doing.
Um, I'm glad to say I like it all. I mean, I
Yeah.
very rarely now have to do things I don't want to do, which at various stages of my career I have had
Hashtag
to.
life goals.
But I do find the most exciting is live theatre. I mean,
Mm.
actually working on a theatrical project. And I think it's because, A, it's more sociable than, I remember once seeing Tom Stoppard interviewed, and the interviewer said, your first success was a novel, Lord Malquist and Mr. Moon, and then you started writing plays. Do you ever wish you continued with the novels? And he said, oh, God, no, no. He said, playwrights have a much better social life,
Ah.
which is actually true because you're
Good
out at
point,
rehearsal,
yeah.
you mix with actors, whereas as a writer of novels, there's really nothing to stop you from sitting behind your keyboard all your life. I mean, there's a
Yes.
bit of research and things, but so theatre gets you out more. And also theatre, it just changes so much.
Mm.
I mean, changes through the rehearsal period. And then if a play is running, you get this, every night is different and something is different. And the various talents that are brought together, I find fascinating. I mean, I guess, I'm kind of stage struck. And I've written 20 books about an active detective, so I'm
Yes.
dealing with it at one level. But I have written quite a few plays of one kind or another, and I haven't really ever had, they've done tours and that kind of thing. So a nice West End success for a play would be what would really be exciting. Whether it's likely to happen at my advanced age, I don't know, but the books will continue.
Well, I'll look out for your work on the West End. I think that would be amazing. Are you on social media?
No, I'm not, I'm afraid. I once, for a character in a book, I did go on social media for a while because the character would have done.
Oh, right.
And I found it I didn't like it. I felt like I was an inadvertent stalker
Yes.
on other people. And
Yeah.
no, I didn't like it at all. And also, I'd be worried that I'd never do any work. Writers are so good at displacement activity
Yes.
that I think social media would be a very dangerous one to get involved in.
I think that's fair enough. But if listeners wanted to know more about you or find out everything you've written, you do have a website.
I do. simonbrett.com. I was actually clever enough and quick enough to pick that up. Yes.
But also kind enough to, on your website, differentiate yourself from Simon Brett, the wood engraver.
Yeah. Yeah, we did finally meet, actually, because we kept getting each other's mail and things. And then, we found, and we'd sort of miss each other at literary festivals and things. He would have been in the room where I was. And we did meet. So he's a delightful man. And I actually bought one of his etchings, a wonderful print of an illustration for St. Agnes Eve by John Keats, which is beautiful. So yes, he's very talented. And then occasionally people will say, gosh, you are amazing. You not only write the books, but you do these wonderful wood engravings too. And I have to say, well, sorry.
Oh, I don't know. I think if you can take credit for the radio adaptations,
yes.
Go ahead and take
any
credit
for
that's
on offer,
absolutely.
grab it.
I think that's a fine philosophy to live by. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Well, thank you.
And we at Listening Books, we are on social media. We do try not to let it distract us too much from work, but you can follow us on Twitter at Listening Books. You can use that same moniker for Instagram. And if you want to find us on Facebook, you're looking for at Listening Books 12, just to shake things up a bit. We'd love to hear from you. And if you've enjoyed this podcast, you can help others find us by linking to us on social media or just by good old-fashioned word of mouth. Thank you so much for listening. The Luminous is produced by Listening Books, a UK charity providing audiobooks for people with an illness, physical or learning disability, or mental health condition which affects their ability to read print or hold a book. If that's you or someone you know, you can find out how to access our more than 8,000 titles, including many of the ones by Simon Brett, by heading to listening-books.org.uk.